My name is Mira Thompson, and I am 67 years old. At this age, I've learned that life rarely betrays us through dramatic storms. Most betrayals start as a soft tapping on the window, a quiet sound we ignore until the whole house shakes. For most of my life, I believed my parents were good people. Flawed, yes, and sometimes self-absorbed, but good in the ways that mattered. I grew up as their only daughter, the quiet child who learned early how to keep the peace. My father favored silence over apologies, and my mother favored image over truth. I learned to navigate them the way a sailor reads wind, carefully, always adjusting, never expecting warmth. After I married my husband, David, things softened. His parents, my in-laws Mark and Evelyn, welcomed me not as an ornament for their son, but as a person worth knowing. It was Evelyn who taught me to cook with herbs instead of salt, and Mark who showed me that a calm voice could carry more authority than anger. They weren't perfect, but they were consistent. And consistency was a luxury in my childhood home. The wedding jewelry Evelyn gifted me, heavy gold bangles, a necklace woven with tiny rubies, and earrings shaped like small sunbursts, wasn't some extravagant tradition. It was her mother's. She said she wanted me to have something that represented strength passed down through the women of her family. I didn't realize then how deeply that statement would matter years later. The jewelry lived in a small cedar box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. I rarely wore it, but each time I opened that box, the pieces seemed to smell faintly of rosemary and old stories. I kept them polished, wrapped carefully, accounted for. Then one summer, long after David had passed away, long after I had retired and begun living quietly in the same house we shared, my parents' calls grew more frequent. My father would insist he simply missed my voice. My mother would glide through conversations with long pauses, waiting for me to ask the question she wanted me to ask. Is everything all right? And each time she'd sigh tragically. We're managing, she'd say. Barely, but we're managing. I didn't pry. I never had. My parents preferred drama without intervention. And honestly, I believed them. After all, they were nearly 90, retired, and living on fixed income. But something shifted when they insisted on visiting me for a weekend. They hadn't visited in years. My mother suddenly wanted to reconnect, and my father, who disliked traveling more than he disliked doctors, agreed without a hint of complaint. Even then, I didn't notice the foreshadowing. I didn't notice the way my mother's eyes scanned the house, room by room. I didn't notice how my father lingered by the closet door when he came to fetch an extra towel. At the time, I simply thought I was lucky. Lucky to have aging parents who finally wanted closeness. Lucky to be entering a season of life where things felt calm and almost peaceful. The night before they left, my mother hugged me longer than usual. Her perfume, sharp, floral, clung to me. We're so proud of you, she whispered. It struck me as odd. Proud of what? I was simply living my quiet life. But her voice trembled with something I didn't understand. Not love. Not pride. Something closer to guilt. 3 days after they returned home, I reached for the cedar box. It was gone. And suddenly, every quiet sound I'd ignored became deafening. I stood there in the closet, hands shaking slightly. Not from age, but from knowing instantly that whatever story my parents had been crafting over months was about to reveal itself. And I had no idea just how deep their betrayal would cut. I remember standing there, staring at the empty space on the shelf, feeling my breath turn shallow. The cedar box had always been there, undisturbed, untouched by anyone but me. Losing it felt like losing a piece of the life I had built with David and the family that had welcomed me with open arms. The first thought that hit me was irrational. I wondered if I'd misplaced it. At 67, you get used to people blaming age for every moment of forgetfulness. But I knew exactly where the box belonged. And I knew exactly when I'd last opened it. Fear didn't come first. Shame did. Shame that I had allowed someone into my home who had taken something so precious. I marched through the house, opening drawers, cabinets, even checking inside the laundry basket as if the box might have tumbled there by accident. But deep down I knew. The only people who had been in my home were my parents. The betrayal fell on me like cold water. That evening, I called them. My mother answered, breathless and oddly cheerful. "Darling," she sang into the receiver, "did you get home safely from the grocery store? You sound winded." "I'm fine," I said. "I'm calling because my wedding jewelry is missing." Silence. Not surprise. Silence. Then my mother's voice flattened. "Are you sure?" "Very sure." Behind her, I heard a soft rustling. My father muttered something. My mother shushed him. When she spoke again, her tone was coated in false concern. "Maybe you moved it. You know how things get misplaced." "I didn't misplace it," I said. She inhaled sharply, a dramatic, wounded sound she had perfected over decades. "Are you implying we took it?" I didn't answer immediately. A lifetime of walking on eggshells around her made me hesitate. But when I finally said, "You were the only ones here," the quiet on the other end of the line became heavy. My father took the phone. "Mira," he said, voice gruff, defensive. "Your mother didn't take anything." His use of "your mother" instead of "we" was telling. He was lying, but he didn't want to lie well. I steadied my breath. "I'm not accusing you," I said. "I'm asking if you saw the cedar box." "No," he snapped. "And frankly, we're insulted." They hung up. It was not outrage I felt, but confirmation. That night, sitting alone at my dining table, I kept replaying the weekend in my mind. My mother's sudden desire to reconnect. My father wandering upstairs. Their hushed conversations. Their overly affectionate goodbye. All the puzzle pieces slid into place with sickening clarity. The next morning, I drove to their house. My father answered the door with the wary expression of a man expecting judgment. My mother appeared behind him, lips tight, eyeliner smudged as though she had cried. Whether for manipulation or remorse, I didn't know. "I want my jewelry back," I said simply. My mother lifted a trembling hand to her chest. "Oh, Mira. We didn't think you'd miss it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The audacity was stunning. She continued, "We needed the money. $60,000. We were drowning. And your father insisted we not bother you." My father cut in sharply, a slip of guilt. "We didn't have a choice." "You had a choice," I said quietly. "You could have asked." "We were ashamed," my mother whispered. I looked at them both, two nearly 90-year-old people who still wielded manipulation like a finely honed instrument. And I felt something inside me calcify. Not anger. Not sadness. Something sturdier. Resolve. I left without another word. But I knew this wasn't over. Not because I wanted revenge. But because they had taken something that never belonged to them. And I was going to get it back. I drove home from my parents' house with my hands clenched around the steering wheel, my mind split between memories and questions. As a child, I had learned to read the emotional weather in that household with the accuracy of a barometer. I could feel the rising pressure before my father's temper, and I could sense the chill in the air before my mother's manipulative tears. What I hadn't sensed, what I never allowed myself to sense, was how deeply their need for control ran. Growing up, money had always been their pivot point. My mother treated it like a fragile glass figurine that could shatter from mishandling, while my father guarded it with a paranoia that bordered on obsession. Their financial decisions were always dramatic. Sudden investments, unplanned renovations, impulsive purchases intended to maintain a facade of comfort. Then would come the panic, the debt, the scramble. I saw it play out like a cycle that repeated every few years, predictable as the changing seasons. I remember once, at age 11, watching my father sell my grandmother's antique dining set because he needed a little breathing room. I remember my mother's silent acceptance, her lips tight, her eyes darting toward me as if to warn me what happened to things left unprotected. Later, in my 20s, during their brief period of financial strain, my mother quietly sold the charm bracelet my aunt had given me for college graduation. When I confronted her, she said, It was just sitting there. You never appreciated it. Their patterns were clear, but I had never once considered they would cross the boundary into my married life, especially not after David passed. The jewelry Evelyn gave me wasn't just expensive. It was sentimental, irreplaceable, woven with the history of a family that had embraced me. But to my parents, value was always transactional. In the days after that confrontation, I found myself thinking back to the time my mother first met Evelyn. The two of them had stood in my living room, both wearing polite smiles, but my mother's eyes had drifted toward Evelyn's jewelry the way a person watches a bird out of reach. Assessing, calculating, coveting. At the time, I brushed it off. I thought she simply admired fine craftsmanship. Now, with the pieces gone and $60,000 pocketed by the people who raised me, I saw it differently. My mother had seen the jewelry as something I didn't deserve to keep. Something she could repurpose to solve her problems. My father saw it as a financial asset, one he could liquidate the moment desperation outweighed morality. But the curious thing about desperation is this: it isn't always real. My parents had cried poor for years, but they were never destitute. Their pension covered necessities, and they had a house fully paid off. They weren't begging for survival. They simply wanted comfort. They wanted the illusion of stability without altering the behavior that eroded it. Their emotional dynamics had always been anchored in entitlement. They believed they could take without asking, because in their eyes, I still owed them. For my childhood. For their sacrifices. For being born, even. They had spent decades convincing themselves that their needs superseded mine. Sitting in my quiet living room now, I realized that retrieving the jewelry wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming boundaries that had been violated since my childhood. I thought about Evelyn and Mark, how they had always shown respect, how they never assumed access to anything of mine. They had treated me as a grown woman with autonomy, not a child whose resources they could dip into. As I sat with this, a new question emerged. If my parents had sold the jewelry, then someone somewhere had bought it. Jewelry like that didn't just vanish into the world. There would be a paper trail, however faint. And for the first time in decades, I felt the stirring of something unfamiliar directed at my parents. Not fear. Not guilt. Not resignation. Determination. They had taught me to expect betrayal. Now I was ready to teach them accountability. The investigation would begin the next morning. I began the next day with a cup of tea and a notepad. When you're 67, introspection comes naturally, but strategy is a skill you either learn or you don't. I had learned. Slowly, painfully, over years of navigating two parents who never spoke the truth unless it benefited them. I wrote down everything I knew. The jewelry was missing on Monday morning. My parents had left on Sunday afternoon. They admitted needing $60,000. They had visited my bedroom more than once. They were the only visitors. Next, I wrote what I didn't know. Where they sold the pieces. When. To whom. Whether the pieces were intact or separated. Whether they had documentation. The jewelry shop I trusted in town hadn't seen anything similar in months. I knew because I called them first. The owner, a soft-spoken woman named Kelsey, asked a few clarifying questions, then gently suggested I check with pawn shops. I hadn't set foot in a pawn shop in decades. But necessity doesn't ask for dignity. The first shop was cluttered, dimly lit, with old guitars hanging like restless spirits. I described the jewelry to the man behind the counter. He shook his head. The second shop had more variety, but again, nothing. The third shop, however, offered a glimmer. A young clerk looked up at my description, narrowing his eyes. Ruby necklace, he asked. Tiny stones, gold setting? My breath caught. Yes. He shrugged. We had something like that come through about 2 weeks ago. But it sold fast. High-end stuff moves quickly. 2 weeks ago. Around the time my parents began hinting about struggle. My pulse steadied with cold clarity. Who bought it? I asked. Can't give names, he said. But it went to a private buyer. That phrase told me everything and nothing. He did, however, offer one more revelation. The seller didn't pawn it, he explained. They sold it outright. No buyback. Looked like an older couple. My stomach tightened. It was them. I thanked him and left, but as I stepped into the sunlight, I realized something important. If the necklace had gone to a private buyer, there was a good chance it had ended up with a collector or someone who knew its value. That meant more paperwork, more communication, more traceable steps. This was no longer a simple theft. It was a transaction. And transactions left trails. When I returned home, I called my in-laws. Not to burden them, but because I needed their clarity. Evelyn answered, her voice warm, concerned the moment she heard mine. Mira, dear, are you all right? I told her everything. Every detail. Every admission. Every clue. Silence filled the phone line, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of my parents' excuses. It was the quiet of someone thinking carefully. Mira, she finally said, those pieces belong to you. Not as my daughter-in-law, but as a woman we trusted. We will help you find them. Mark joined the conversation moments later. His voice, grounded and steady, cut straight to action. Send me the details of the pawn shop and the description of the pieces. I'll reach out to a contact of mine who handles estate jewelry acquisitions. Within an hour, he had an answer. Mira, he said in a low voice, I think we found where your jewelry went. My breath caught. Where? I'll explain everything, he said. But not on the phone. Can we come to you tomorrow morning? His tone held something else. Something heavy. We'll drive over, he added. And bring coffee. You'll want to sit down for this. A chill ran through me. For them to insist on delivering news in person, I knew the truth was tangled deeper than I had imagined. And I had no idea that this unraveling would not just lead me to my jewelry. It would lead me to something far more shocking. The next morning, the doorbell rang at precisely 9. Mark and Evelyn entered with the familiar warmth that had always softened the silence of my home. But today, their expressions carried tension, an unusual seriousness I couldn't ignore. We sat at the dining table. Evelyn placed a thermos of coffee and 2 pastries on the table, but neither she nor Mark touched them. Mira, Mark began gently. I reached out to a trusted acquaintance in the high-end jewelry market. Someone who keeps an eye on major private sales. My heart tightened. And he confirmed that a ruby necklace matching your description was purchased 2 weeks ago by a private collector who only buys pieces with certificates of authenticity. My eyes narrowed. But the necklace didn't have a certificate. Evelyn's mother kept everything informal. Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes. Which means whoever sold it must have improvised. Mark pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. This is why we wanted to speak in person. Inside the envelope was a printed scan of a handwritten document. A certificate. A forged certificate. My mother's handwriting. The air left my lungs in a rush. The document wasn't just sloppy. It was blatant. My mother had signed Evelyn's mother's name. She had drawn a fake crest. She had even written the words, transferred to daughter-in-law Mira Thompson as dowry. Evelyn's face tightened. My mother never used the word dowry. Ever. I stared at the signature, my mother's curves and loops unmistakable. Shame pricked my chest. Shame for her, shame for myself, shame for every moment I had overlooked the truth. My parents hadn't simply sold my jewelry, they had counterfeited a family legacy. I swallowed hard. Who has the necklace now? Mark exchanged a glance with Evelyn. That's the part you need to hear carefully. The collector who bought it is reputable, professional. And he also recognized the forgery. My breath froze. He did. He did, Mark confirmed. And that's why he didn't destroy it or resell it. He felt something was off. He reached out to my contact, asking if anyone knew the true provenance. So he wants to return it. I whispered. Yes, Mark said. But only to the rightful owner. Something inside me loosened. Me. Evelyn touched my hand. You, Mira. Your name. Not your parents. I exhaled shakily, but before I could speak, Mark continued. But there's more. He didn't just buy the necklace. He purchased the entire set as a collection. I blinked. The bangles? The earrings? All of it, he said. Which means your parents sold the full set together. For $60,000. Tears gathered in my eyes. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer weight of knowing the extent of the deception. My parents hadn't hesitated. They hadn't second-guessed. They hadn't cared. But Mark wasn't finished. The collector has agreed to return everything, he said. He insists it should remain with you as the intended heir. And, in recognition of the emotional damage, he is willing to transfer it under your name formally. Evelyn squeezed my hand again. But Mira, he refuses to do this quietly. I lifted my gaze. What does that mean? Mark slid another document across the table. He will only return the jewelry if you acknowledge the sale, the forgery, and the motive in a formal statement. He needs your recorded confirmation to protect himself legally. I stared at the paper. An affidavit template. Simple language. Direct. But it required one thing I had never done publicly. Admit my parents had betrayed me. I looked up at my in-laws, whose eyes held compassion, not judgment. Are you ready to do that? Mark asked gently. The room fell silent. And I felt something shift inside me, something like grief blooming into resolve. Yes, I said quietly. I am ready. Little did I know this was only the beginning of the confrontation that would shake 3 generations. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon, affidavit in hand, determination guiding me like a compass. For once, I didn't feel the old tremors of childhood fear. I felt clarity. And clarity is liberating. My father opened the door, his face tight with annoyance. You should call before dropping by, he grumbled. I stepped past him without responding. My mother sat in the living room, wearing a silk robe and a posture of fragile innocence. Mira, she breathed. You startled us. I sat across from her. Not too close. Not too far. We need to talk. She pressed a hand dramatically to her chest. If this is about the jewelry, we already explained. No, I interrupted calmly. You didn't explain. You lied. And forged. And sold something that wasn't yours. Her eyes flickered, the smallest flash of guilt. Then she slid into performance mode. We were desperate. Your father's blood pressure. I placed the forged certificate on the table. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. My father stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he recognized the paper. You went digging, he snapped. I didn't need to dig, I said. The buyer recognized the forgery. He's returning everything to me. My mother's jaw fell open, but she quickly masked it with indignation. Well, good. Then we can have it back and pay him. No, I said. Not we. Me. The buyer will only transfer it to me. My father's face darkened. You ungrateful child. Ungrateful. The word landed like a stone thrown from a distance. Familiar, but irrelevant now. I slid the affidavit across the table. I need you both to sign this acknowledgement of the sale and the forgery. The collector requires it legally. My mother's voice rose several octaves. We will not sign anything admitting wrongdoing. You already admitted it, I reminded her. When you told me you needed the 60,000. Her face twisted. You're twisting our words. No, I said gently. I'm repeating them. My father leaned forward. What will you do if we don't sign? You think you can force us? At our age. I held his gaze. No, I won't force you. I'll simply submit what I already have, the forged document in your handwriting, and the collector will proceed without your cooperation. And you will effectively be documented as having committed fraud and theft from your own daughter. My mother paled. Mira, you wouldn't. I would, I said calmly. Because this is bigger than jewelry. This is about what you did to me. What you've done to me my whole life. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, my mother whispered, "We didn't think you'd fight back." For the first time, she spoke the truth. My father sank into the armchair. His voice came out hoarse. "We didn't think you'd notice." My heart clenched. Not from heartbreak, but from the stunning honesty of the sentence. They never believed I was paying attention. I placed 2 pens on the table. "If you sign, this stays between us and the collector. No legal charges. No public record. Just the truth acknowledged." My mother's hands trembled as she reached for the pen first. She hesitated. "Mira, are you doing this to punish us?" "No," I said softly. "I'm doing this to stop the pattern. For both of us." They signed. Both signatures shaky, both heavy. When it was done, my mother leaned back, tears spilling, real ones, not the theatrical kind. "We made a terrible mistake," she whispered. We thought you'd forgive us like always." I held her gaze. "I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't erase accountability." My father looked away, ashamed but finally silent. I collected the affidavit, folded it carefully, and stood. "This is the last time you'll take something from me," I said quietly. And for the first time in my life, they did not argue. The following week unfolded with the precision of a closing chapter. I emailed the signed affidavit to Mark's contact, who forwarded it to the collector. He responded within an hour, confirming the documents satisfied his legal requirements. 2 days later, a secure courier service arrived at my home. The delivery required signatures, verification, and a small ceremony of caution. When I opened the padded case, I felt the air thicken. There they were. The sunburst earrings. The ruby necklace. The gold bangles. Perfect. Untouched. Preserved. I lifted each piece with slow reverence. They felt heavier than before, not in weight, but in meaning. These weren't just ornaments. They were chapters of my life. Marks of care from people who had chosen me. A lineage I had been entrusted with. The collector had included a note. "For the rightful owner. Respectfully returned." I placed the jewelry back into the cedar box, the same box my parents had tried so hard to empty. But now, it carried something additional. Proof that truth, once brought to light, has a way of restoring what was taken. The consequences for my parents were quieter but just as real. Wordlessly, they returned the entire $60,000, not voluntarily, but because the affidavit left no wiggle room. They dipped into their savings, grumbling but compliant. Our relationship changed. Not with dramatic declarations, but with distance, a healthy, necessary distance. I still visited them occasionally. I still checked on their health. But I had built a boundary that held firm. They no longer asked for money. They no longer entered my home uninvited. And they never again mentioned the jewelry. My in-laws, however, stepped closer in ways I hadn't expected. They invited me for dinners. Brought me fruit from their garden. And when I showed Evelyn the restored pieces, she cried quietly into her handkerchief. "I'm glad they're back with you," she whispered. "Where they belonged all along." Mark nodded. "You handled this with more grace than many would." But grace wasn't what I felt. What I felt was clarity, a sense of standing on solid ground for the first time in decades. The consequences extended beyond family dynamics. Something inside me shifted permanently. I no longer apologized for asking questions. I no longer hesitated to assert boundaries. And I no longer carried the old childhood burden of taking responsibility for my parents' choices. Word of the situation never spread publicly, thanks to the confidentiality agreement. But the impact remained in small, measurable ways. My parents became subdued, less extravagant in their stories of financial doom. For the first time, they acted like people who understood consequences. And me. I learned how quiet justice could be. Not loud. Not vengeful. Just steady. The jewelry's return didn't fix everything. But it restored something important. My sense of agency, my connection to David's family, and my belief that truth, approached calmly, can win battles rage never could. The day after the jewelry returned, I placed the cedar box back on its shelf. But this time, I added a small note inside. Recovered. Not lost. It wasn't for anyone else to read. It was for me. A reminder of the moment I chose my own voice over silence. I didn't know then what the final moral of this story would be. But I felt it coming. It shimmered in the air, subtle and steady. And when it finally landed, it changed the shape of the rest of my life. At 67, I've learned that life is full of betrayals. Large and small, intentional and careless, whispered and shouted. But the most dangerous betrayals come from those you are taught to forgive before they even ask. My parents taught me many lessons growing up. Some were useful: how to budget, how to keep a tidy home, how to maintain composure in public. But the most insidious lesson they taught me was silence. A silence that protected them. A silence that diminished me. A silence that allowed their needs to eclipse my own. When they stole my wedding jewelry, I realized something essential. Silence is not the same as peace. Peace requires truth. Peace requires boundaries. Peace requires courage. I confronted them not to punish, but to reclaim my place in the narrative of my own life. I demanded accountability not to humiliate them, but to finally stand tall in a room where I had once learned to shrink. And what surprised me most wasn't how they reacted, it was how I reacted. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I didn't crumble. I simply told the truth. Calmly. Clearly. Without fear. And the truth did what truth always does. It steadied me. It revealed character. It forced consequences. It restored what had been taken. My parents will never be perfect. They may never understand the depth of their wrongdoing. They may never look at me with the remorse I once wished for. But I no longer need that from them. I have my boundaries. I have my clarity. And I have a family in Mark and Evelyn who show me that love doesn't manipulate, steal, or guilt. Love steadies. Love respects. Love returns what was lost. Sometimes, revenge is dramatic. Explosive. Filled with shouting and chaos. But my kind of revenge, ethical revenge, is quieter. It's the kind built from truth and documentation, from calm confrontation, from a steady refusal to be diminished. It's the kind that says, you may break trust, but you cannot break me. You may take something, but I will take back my power. You may betray me, but I will rise with integrity intact. The jewelry sits on my shelf now, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder. A reminder of Evelyn's kindness, of Mark's steadfastness, of David's love, of my own strength, and of the simple, powerful truth that recovery is possible at any age. So if someone listening to this story has been betrayed, by family, by friends, by someone they trusted, hear this from me, a woman who didn't learn boundaries until her late 60s. It is never too late to stand up. Never too late to demand accountability. Never too late to reclaim what was taken. Never too late to grow into your own courage. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. And sometimes, the whisper is enough to change everything. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've been through something similar, or if this reminded you of a betrayal you overcame, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them. Reflect on them. You never know who might need to hear your voice the way you needed to hear mine. And remember, truth is not a weapon. It is a light. And once you shine it, the darkness has nowhere left to hide.